Oh, there we go. I think it's good now.
Is it?
Yeah, well, it says meetings now streaming live on Facebook, so I said, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, shall we start it off then?
Yeah, now you can do it.
Okay.
Sorry.
Hi everyone who's tuned in to our first webinar today. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. And so essentially today's panel consists of Gobin from Malaysia, Priyank from USA, Dara from UK, Shafkat from Bangladesh, and Rafra from Pakistan. And today's topic is free speech. And as Shafkat will tell you in a moment, the objective of today's panel discussion is to gauge our views on how free speech needs to be viewed, philosophies, the models that have followed, and a various amount of information that will help people understand how free speech works across our varying jurisdictions, especially having a wide range of people on our panel from different parts of the world. And so what I will do now is pass the mic to Shafkat. And before doing that, I will just introduce him. And so Shafkat is a barrister at law and a research assistant at the Center of Peace and Justice, focusing on constitutional law and human rights protection. And so he will elaborate more about himself and what our objectives are today. So Shafkat, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. And obviously, it's absolutely brilliant to be a part of these panels with the hopes that we'll be able to do this more often and do this more frequently. Let's start off with the discussion of why we value free speech, because at the end of the day, I think it's one of those core fragments of our society that we have to always kind of come across in various forms of ways. So as per Stanley Fish, free speech in and of itself is not an independent value. The reason you value free speech is because it allows you to impart your own vision and identity on another. And it is quite literally a means to an end where you use free speech, or you use your ability to speak or express yourself in a way where you use it in the form of a political tool and or prize. But that being said, free speech in the ability to express yourself is something that we all tend to inherently enjoy at some level or the other. It's never a question as to whether free speech is absolutely unfettered or absolutely restricted, but it is always a question of where between those two ends on the spectrum do we impart a lot of these limitations. So today's discussion amongst ourselves will take place in basically three segments to make it simple. So the first thing we'll do is we'll start talking about free speech philosophy. I'll start that discussion off, and then we'll move on to the rest of the panelists and hear their thoughts about it. The second thing that we'll do is we'll start talking about the ways in which free speech is regulated across different jurisdictions. And in particular, we're looking at the jurisdictions of the US, the UK, broadly. Then we'll be looking at Asia and Africa, Pan-Africa to be exact. And then once we've got that bare bones understanding of how different jurisdictions work with freedom of speech regulations, we'll then move on to having a small discussion on the degree to which this political tool, as mentioned before, has had an impact on how we view politics today, and the ways in which we can ultimately use free speech in a way that creates a better world for tomorrow and gives most people the greatest avenue for discourse and discussion. But in having said all of this, let's bear in mind it's relatively important that we don't necessarily speak about any particular jurisdiction or in specific, and we don't particularly speak about any particular political system or political identity in specific. The reason we're setting these rules as we move forward with these discussions is because the objective of the panel is ultimately to create academic discourse and not necessarily offend or in any way hurt anyone's feelings. So we're going to try and keep this as general as possible, and the discussion shall remain as broad as possible. So without further ado, let's start talking about how free speech regulations typically work, right? Effectively, there have always been individuals who've been in a position where they've advocated for free speech, and in many cases, most of us know some of the big names here. John Stuart Mills, one of the most ardent proponents for free speech, argued for, in defense of Galileo, and argued quite heavily with the idea that ultimately you need to have unfettered free speech, because when you have unfettered free speech, what you're creating is a continuous chain of discourse where you allow individuals to kind of figure out for themselves what the best version of the truth is. This philosophy was famously coined as the marketplace of ideas. It simply imposes the idea of a capitalistic society into what is the ideal for when you use free speech or when you use certain ideas as some form of currency. So the objective being that with more currency or expressions being in circulation, ultimately the best among this will rise to the top, and that becomes the ideology that we follow. The reason I love J.S. Mills, right, and this is entirely personal, and take this as a personal opinion. I love this man because this man is a utopian thinker, and he's talking about an ideal. I hate him at the same time because he is a utopian thinker, and therefore in that philosophy, there are certain cracks. Whenever you are a utopian thinker, much like Kant's perpetual peace, what you're effectively doing is creating an ideal to aspire towards. But in order to get to that ideal, you're going to end up having to spend generations worth of harm, right? So that is generations who either in pursuit of that ideal suffer the harms because of the principle that can only exist within that ideal, or you force generations into certain degrees of restrictions and you push them towards creating the perfect social structure in which that ideal exists. The reason this understanding is important is because we have to recognize that ultimately we're looking at free speech not in a vacuum, but in a social setting. And as long as there are social individuals within a community, there is going to be a degree of power asymmetry, and there's going to be a hierarchy of power. And so long as that asymmetry exists, we have to regulate and understand where to put barriers to make sure that one's vision does not overpower the other. We have to understand we have to understand where we draw lines in certain ways so that we make sure that the least amount of people are harmed, that the least amount of people are being sacrificed in order to get to that ideal. So having said that, I think it's now important that we hear from the rest of our panelists, because my views on free speech is relatively this, that we are going to be for the remainder of our lives in a constant state of oscillation between the two ends of absolute restriction and absolutely no restrictions. And it is our job as academics to identify where, in case of each social setting, we want to see these lines appear. So without further ado, I would love to invite Priyank, who's had a history of working with free speech regulation, who's had a history of working with national security and a series of other things, but he does it in the light of comedy. Priyank is the CEO of Mythos Labs, and an organization that uses entertainment and technology to counter harmful narratives and misinformation and or disinformation. Priyank is also just an insanely funny man, and he's a good friend of mine, so I'm going to pass it on to him. Best of luck, buddy.
Thanks, Shafqat. Thank you for the very kind introduction. Thank you all for joining us and for inviting me to share my views on this really cool group of people we've assembled from all over the world. So as Shafqat mentioned, my background is in national security, but also as a comedy writer for The Onion in New York. And now I run Mythos Labs. We partner with comedians in different countries to make funny videos that counter harmful narratives, from videos that counter ISIS's recruitment narrative to videos that counter gender, misogynist narratives, climate change denial, etc., etc. We also do some work on the AI front using artificial intelligence to monitor, identify, and assess the impact of online misinformation. And we do a lot of digital literacy and social media literacy awareness campaigns and trainings, particularly in Southeast Asia, South Asia, North Africa, and Eastern Europe. So my context coming in from this, or my point of view rather, is that of a practitioner. So I don't have the academic credentials that a lot of the esteemed colleagues I'm on this panel with have. I've sort of spent most of my career in the field. When I worked in national security, I was in Egypt and a little bit in South Asia as well. So I guess I could talk a little bit about the practical implications of free speech. Because certainly when I was a master's student learning about it in political science classes, I had a certain set of views on free speech. And when I was, in Cairo the night before the Arab Spring, I had a different view of free speech. So my thinking is very much informed by the dangers and the question that I've sort of struggled with a lot throughout my career is how much should the government be in charge of regulating what is considered free speech and what is not, or sorry, what is acceptable free speech and what is not. And more often than not, what I found is that being in conflict zones, if you're in a, Cairo in 2010 is a great example. I was among some of the folks that were there right around the time that the Arab Spring was happening. And what we saw was that in the beginning, whenever I think of free speech, I think of those few months, because I remember in the beginning, it was a really hopeful mood in the country. Anybody who was in Egypt in 2010 would remember that there was this optimism that maybe there will be change and that this was being done the right way. People were using freedom of speech. It was the first time Facebook had been used as a major geopolitical force. We're used to that now, thinking that Facebook can cause, rebellions and revolutions and sway elections. But in 2010, that was unheard of. I remember that very quickly kind of changing. And if you were on the ground, suddenly you started hearing more stories about people targeting certain groups, targeting certain actors, sharing the locations of government officials so that they could be abused and kidnapped or worse. Then, of course, the other side of that the government really cracking down on free speech and saying, because of the extraordinary circumstances we're in, we're going to suspend Facebook, we're going to suspend people's access to the internet, et cetera, et cetera. You started hearing rumors of that. And what we saw really quickly was that the line between causing change and causing trouble is very blurry when it comes to free speech. If you're on the ground, one thing that might be a little controversial for me to say, but if you're on the ground in a dangerous situation, a conflict zone, you sort of see the Overton window narrow, so to say, and what becomes acceptable becomes much narrower simply because of the danger that people are put into. So I, being a staunch free speech advocate and left of center, just a few months before that when I was in the United States, found myself sort of hoping that there would be more, restrictions on what people could say and couldn't say, because I was hearing stories of friends, colleagues being sort of targeted by mobs on social media that were able to post information about them or harass them with relative impunity. So, I just want to maybe open it up to my fellow colleagues with that kind of food for thought, that how do you guys reconcile with the fact that we're all for free speech when we're on a webinar in the comfort of our own homes, but if you're in a battlefield in Iraq or Afghanistan, or in a very volatile situation where your physical safety is in danger and somebody's saying, I'm going to post her address online and we'll let people take care of it, should there be a framework for should free speech laws rather be mutable and flexible, and should the determining factor of when to change them and when to adapt them be threat levels in the country? Or is that a really dangerous Pandora's box to open, because it obviously runs the risk of governments deciding when you're in danger, when you're not in danger? And perhaps we're seeing that in certain parts of the world right now, where governments can take liberties with that and abuse that power. So that's kind of my question for the folks who are more knowledgeable about this than I am on the group. And I'd like to now pass it to Gobind, our next speaker, Gobind Pannu, who's a barrister at law, and he is a paralegal at Bachchan and Qatar. He's also an avid scriptwriter who presents the realities of the world through art, which I'd love to hear more about. So Gobind, over to you.
Thank you very much, Priyank. Well, I mean, I can't speak for being in a war zone. I haven't really been in many, but being in Malaysia, we live in a fairly multicultural society with many different, it's a melting pot of different races, different religions, and we all have to find a way to get along. So, so when you talk about free speech, then I guess you do have to consider the extremes on either end and how both of them will not be viable, and you always have to fall somewhere in the middle for it to actually be viable in the real world. You can have in one extreme the freedom to say absolutely anything at all with no repercussions. That would be a recipe for disaster, to be honest, because everyone will just go around offending other people, and there'll be anarchy in the streets in 2 days. The other option would be relentless persecution for anything that is said that is deemed to be unsavory by a specified party. That is also not fair, because then the question arises: who told you? Who made you the boss? Who gave you the decision to decide what's okay to say and what's not okay to say? And it all becomes very subjective. So the issue really lies in determining who is the person behind determining what is fair and what is unfair to be spoken. And for I can only speak for Malaysia. In Malaysia, being the melting pot that we are, we do tend to deal with things in a sort of we'll give you the right to say whatever you want to say, but also understand that the freedom of speech does not provide you for freedom for does not automatically give you the freedom for consequences. Also, if you say something, you then have to face the consequences, and there can't be freedom of speech without consequences. There has to be repercussions for anything that is said. And also the intention of what is said should be explored as well. If something was said purely for the intent to upset another person, or if it was said to provoke another person, then that's obviously not okay. But if something was said just because it's something that someone truly believes, then that person then it goes to say that it's probably not okay for persecution in that case. So there's a lot. It is obviously a very, very, very sensitive topic, and I would like to hear more from Dara and the rest. But in my view, I think as long as we fall somewhere in the middle, and we have a fair understanding of these things are okay to say, these things are not okay to say. Not okay to say. It's very obvious why you don't just scream fire in the middle of the tube, or when you're in a busy street. It's not okay to say those things, and those things are very understandable. So as long as there are rules, and as long as those rules are easily explained, I think that'll be the best way to move forwards with it. And with that, I would like to ask Dara if about her opinion. Dara is a PhD candidate at Durham University, and she's researching international human rights and culture. Dara also teaches public law and UN security law at Liverpool John Moores University.
Hi, so yes, I come from a bit more of an academic background. So I'm going to refer to a bit of philosophy that I've covered in my academic life. As Shaf, or as Ahmed or Shaf has mentioned already, John Stuart Mills is a really, really influential person in this area. And something that inspires my point of view is the idea that so free speech, as we've mentioned, is not an absolute right. So we can look at things to regulate that right. And I look at John Stuart Mills and think about his harm principle. And this is really the idea that the government can only justify telling you what you can and can't do whenever you're limiting someone else's rights and that someone else's liberty. So when I'm talking about this, I want to think about two things. I want to think about the subjectivity of harm and harm. So I want to take you on a journey, and this is a journey that is inspired by someone called Joseph Feinberg. So everyone, imagine you're on a bus, okay? We're on a bus and we're rushing to an appointment. Now on this bus, someone comes on and they're in a t-shirt, and it's a very obnoxious color. It's maybe an orange t-shirt and there's something like a swear word on it. Then that's the first person that comes on the bus, and that's what you're confronted with. The next person that you're confronted with is someone who comes on the bus and they're maybe eating a sandwich very loudly, the food is going everywhere and it's very uncomfortable for everyone. The next person that comes onto the bus is somebody who's clearly been to a protest and they're carrying a sign that is very offensive, that it has maybe something that is a racial slur on this sign. And you see that. And then the last person that comes on is maybe someone who is nude, they're with their partner who is also nude, and they start to fondle each other. Now, I can imagine that you probably found the last two more offensive or found them more difficult to deal with than hearing about the first two. But it's subjective. So harm and what you experience is always going to be subjective. So depending on where you're from in the world, what your personal ethics are, where you grew up, how your family have raised you, how you have experienced all sorts of lived things in your life, will depend on which of these things you find the most offensive or how you experience each of them. So somebody who is maybe part of the racial group that sign was offending would probably experience that and experience a lot more harm in that situation than they will than someone else. So when we're talking about free speech and freedom of expression, how that impacts others, if we're talking about harm and we're talking about the harm principle and we're saying it's justifiable to step in when other people are experiencing harm, well, harm is so subjective. And I would argue that Feinberg's bus, his idea, those more really, really offensive, really harmful things at the end of the bus, the things that we experience later on, you can justify stepping in to prevent people from having that harm because they're maybe a little bit more objectively offensive. But it's very difficult to say, okay, well, what about that obnoxious t-shirt? Is that really something that the state should be intervening in? Are people really experiencing a level of harm? And I want to explain also, when we talk about subjective harm, you can think about maybe someone who has an eating disorder. If someone then starts to insult your body or use hate speech in a way that is then going to offend someone about their body image, someone who has never experienced an eating disorder isn't going to experience the same level of harm as someone who has experienced an eating disorder. So we need to think, okay, these things are really, really subjective. It's very hard to draw the line and work out where is it appropriate for the government to step in. So we need to think about that later end of the bus. What is something that is almost objectively completely wrong? That is where I think we should be stepping in. We need to think about the level of harm that people experience. And then we need to think, okay, even though harm is so subjective and that is problematic and it's difficult to work out what is really going to cause people harm, we can think, okay, what's going to cause the most people harm? What is something that nearly all of us are going to be offended by and experience some kind of harmful feeling after feeling that offense? Then that's really where we should be stepping in. And that's my opinion. And now I would like to pass it back to
Anjali, do you want to take a shot at it? Dora, you can pass it on to Angelique. Angelique is a founder of AJ Mediation Services and Legal Consultancy in Seychelles, and it is one of the first independent mediation firms that she's set up. And she's a big advocate for quick access to dispute resolutions in Seychelles, and she's working to spread that awareness around the world. So your take on freedom of speech, Angelique.
Thank you, Ruff, and welcome everyone who's tuned in. I think I share the similar views as my panelists as well. I do not have a philosophical bone in my body, so unfortunately I won't be able to be mentioning about J.S. Mills or all those people. But from what I got from Dara as well, thank you for enlightening me on these philosophical backgrounds and all that, is that, like Govind mentioned as well, I come from Seychelles and we have a diverse culture, and so we're a melting pot as well. And we're also a very tiny island. We have 98,000 people. And so in terms of freedom of speech, like you say, there needs to be this balancing act between what can and can't be said, how the government impacts that and what they can control or can't control. And to say control is quite hands down, like it really isn't the word. I can't really think of the word now. But in terms of free speech, I think that it is quite important to have this balancing act that everyone has shared before, because you can't just one day wake up and say whatever's on your mind and offend anyone and everyone you want. And so, like Dara was mentioning, how there needs to be this objectiveness of what the government deems as harmful to people. But I also would like to question of whether in one instance there's a minority group that does feel that this speech is affecting them. So then how does the government deal with that? And like Priyank mentioned, this flexibility in the government is quite important. But how many governments right now dealing with the COVID pandemic, especially, how are they going to respond to now having to make this law flexible? Is it something that can be done? Is it viable in certain areas? Because Africa as well, there are certain areas that have really no sense of freedom of speech. And so they will have this whole going back and teaching the people and giving them access to information about freedom of speech. But then you contrast that with South Africa, who's working really hard on opening up the freedom of speech and all of this. And so this whole freedom of speech topic is quite controversial in any essence jurisdiction as well, because how do we control it, to say control, or how does the government respond to it? I think in my country, Seychelles, it really isn't a major problem because everyone here kind of understands where the line is drawn, so that the government doesn't really have to come and impose anything to say, oh no, you can't say this. However, like I was saying, it's really hard to see where this line will be drawn and if it can be drawn. And so to say that you can have unfettered rights of speech is quite wrong. And I personally feel that that will not be a good idea, because at the end of the day, people do get hurt, irregardless of what is said, and how they get hurt is subjective. And so I think, like we will continue to discuss, is the jurisdiction as well is quite important. It's quite an important aspect when dealing with how governments will deal with freedom of speech. And so it might be different for Bangladesh, Malaysia, but it might be quite similar for Malaysia and Seychelles, given that we have this diversified group of people. And so as well, I think that understanding this and the education behind how free speech should work is quite important. And so the philosophies as well and Priyank's experiences also help people understand how this is an issue that we need to all address and people need to understand. And so what I will do is I will pass it on to Ruff, who will pass it on to Shafkat, and we will continue with our web series. Thank you.
So hello everyone, and thank you. I just wanted to welcome all the guests we have who are actually viewing us online and a part of this meeting as well. So my take on freedom of speech is a little contingent upon the fact that the right to information as another right, a correlation between freedom of speech and the right of information. That is, that to have freedom of speech, you need to have right to information as well to make informed opinion on it. So it actually depends upon how each jurisdiction actually treats both these rights together. Speaking from Pakistani perspective, these are two fundamental rights which are enshrined in our constitution. 19 and 19A is saying that you have the freedom of speech, but it's not absolute. You have the freedom to right to information, and every person regarding the state can ask for those information, but there would be reasonable restrictions as well. So the problem in Pakistan when it comes to freedom of speech is that we are like Malaysia and Seychelles. We still are a country which have different cultures, and we do get offended by cultural differences, or the fact that we still are a country which has multiple religions in it, but we have not yet formed that peace within ourselves that we can actually be able to accept the other person's opinion. So it becomes very tricky when we say, oh, we need to have an absolute freedom of speech, because while we inherently as humans are not able to take on anyone else's opinion apart from us. So when we're talking about freedom of speech, one of the major lackings comes in how you define freedom of speech in your constitutions, or if you're coming from a common law jurisdictions, how is freedom of speech actually laid down, and the restrictions that are laid down on freedom of speech. So speaking from the Pakistani perspective, we are very, very happy to say, oh, we are a country which acknowledges the freedom of speech, but then we are a country also putting restrictions on it. And the problem comes there when we don't define those restrictions and we give a leeway to the government to access those and put restraints and fetter those rights whenever they want to, which confuses the public in general, and which confuses me right now as well. How can I use my own platform right now to speak, and what length? And Shafkat is really smiling at this because he faces the same difficulty, because we do not know yet to what extent we can use our own mediums to talk about freedom of speech being an example, because we are not aware when our governments or our regulatory bodies are going to take offense of the fact that what we have said fall under those restrictions. So the problem really comes in for countries who have a codified constitution and how we restrict those reasonable restrictions. So R really states down the fact that it's a reasonable restriction, but again, the question comes in: whose point of view are we considering? Is it going to be what Shafkat doesn't like? Is it going to be from the point of view of Gobind? And is it going to be from Dara sitting in the UK considering, oh, this is not reasonable of what Dr. has just said? So coming from a legal point of view, I think freedom of speech not being an absolute right is accurate because of the kind of world we live in yet. We have not yet advanced enough to fully accept each other's opinion, but we still are in the process where we do not understand what reasonable restrictions are, because our legislators around the world, looking at the Indian constitution, looking at the constitution of Bangladesh as well, we do not put enough information out there for our public to understand this right that is given. And that's why the balance is actually out of place, and it's unlikely to be achieved unless we make it very, very clear for the public of the jurisdictions which we are talking about, that fine, this is the limit, you don't cross this, this is a certain example, if you do this, you cross it, which makes it easier for people to exercise our right. So that's my take on freedom of speech, contingent upon the right for information. And I'll pass it on to Shafkat, who's going to talk about another segment we have for today's agenda.
Right. I mean, brilliant segue, to be very honest, because we're coming to the point where we're starting to talk about how to consider drawing these lines, which is where we start discussing how different jurisdictions have created these restrictions on free speech. Before going into that, I think it's slightly important to acknowledge some of the things that our panelists have said today. I think when we've heard from multiple panelists today, and all of them seem to be of the opinion that you don't need an absolute version of either. There's that line that you need to figure out, and that's what we're all trying to strive towards. What I'd like to bring up as we move on to our next segment is a consideration of that very thing, right? So Dara talks about the harm principle as we hear about Feinberg's description of the bus and the different myriads of people who come on wearing different things, and how each of them can have a degree of offense that they impart onto whoever is in the bus or whoever is the passenger of the bus. Similarly, you think of Dan Riley, who writes about bad words, and you think about the sort of language that used to once be acceptable, but that eventually got taken out of modern usage because of the degree of harm that we associated with that word. The reason I think that this is interesting, right, is because whenever you're thinking about this hierarchy of harms, you're also thinking about who's designing that hierarchy to begin with. Human beings, being the social individuals that we are, we live in a structured society, which means that there are individuals within that societal structure who have a greater voice than many of the others, right? Not all platforms are equal. the voice of the president of a nation is going to be heard a lot louder than the voice of an oppressed minority within that same nation. And therefore, when it's absolutely okay to curb down on the rights of the larger voice, it is infinitesimally more horrendous when you curb down on the voice of the minority community. But vice versa, to the individual whose rights are being curbed, it is significantly, it is an offense directly, attributed to what they're trying to do. So having an understanding of that means that it is also important that we understand two things. One is, I would argue, as Hobbes will put it in Leviathan, the inherent incentive structures amongst people. This is the understanding that everyone's incentivized to look out for their self-interest, and therefore whatever influence that they impart on society is likely going to be based upon what they want to see coming out of society. The second thing I'd argue is Schauer's argument of the slippery slope. The reason this is important is while we were discussing the question of who gets to impose these restrictions and whether it should be the government or whether it should be us self-regulating ourselves, there is that argument that whoever is asked to do this falls down the slippery slope. When it's the government who's regulating us, there is that possibility that because of the government's incentive structures, they tend to be overzealous in the responses, as we've seen in multiple different jurisdictions, as we'll eventually explore. But on the other end of things, when it's the people who are trying to impose exercise their freedom of speech in the exercise of their other values, there is that possibility that in their demand to take up a greater space within that civic arena, they end up taking that overzealous response and pushing out those with a smaller platform from that civic arena, and that is equally problematic. Hence, with that, we look at the different jurisdictions and the different settings of restrictions on freedom of speech that exist. I'll start us off with this discussion and with this notion. Apart from perhaps the US Constitution, which in itself has certain restrictions weaved into it, there is no other document in the world that gives free speech an unfettered value. That is to say that every other document, whether it be constitutions, whether it be charters of rights across multiple jurisdictions, it has typically been the notion that people understand that there needs to be a certain degree of regulation that comes with the exercise of free speech. Again, myriads of harms, myriads of levels of subjectivity that play into that discussion. Typically, there are a couple of main ways in which this is done. You'll see within the spectrum of free speech, the version where there is an absolutely no restriction, which is typically what we see within the US model. You will see a version that is contingent on the proportionality, which is what Dara, Angelique, Govind, and Priyank also allude to, which is whenever there is a degree of harm based on the content of the speech and the form that the speech takes, the extent of the reach of the speech and the degree of the harm that it can impart, we tend to take a proportionate response in how we restrict them. This is typically found in most jurisdictions that adapt a judicial review setting. And most famously, this has been found in the European Court of Human Rights, where proportionality based on the necessity of a response is the way in which we try to gauge the line that we draw in the sand. And I know for a fact that because Dara and I went to the same free speech classes, this is eventually going to come up in discussion. Yes, the proportionality metric is typically an assessment of the law and not necessarily of the content of the speech, but I'm happy to argue that it is through the assessment of where the law draws these lines that we ultimately decide on what sort of content we feel is acceptable, not acceptable in many cases, or the delivery of that content and how it's being shaped. Finally, we have that categorization of absolute restrictions, where in certain cases we see across the world, the people are unable to entirely exercise their freedom of speech. But further to this, there are subcategories. You will note that there are discussions of content neutral restrictions. There are discussions content-based restrictions. Judges across the world will try to figure out whether they want to regulate the content that's being spoken, or whether they want to regulate the way in which it's being delivered. Because understand, your audience makes a difference. If you're gonna scream bloody murder in the absolute vacuum of space, nobody cares. But if you're gonna say something that could potentially alienate a minority while you're in the middle of a religious sermon, that's potentially problematic. So again, these are things that we are going to be taking into account. And I would love to now pass it on to Rafraf to maybe give us a little bit of an idea of what she was, where she was coming from. When you consider all of these different restrictions, and when you consider all of these different forms that these restrictions can take, whether these rights be liberties or whether these rights need to be claimed, how do you feel that we should endeavor to now draw these new lines in the sand? I'd love to hear from Rafraf and then the rest of the panelists as we go along.
Well, yeah, these are rights which we can get enforced, but the problem where I come from is the uncertainty of whether this is my right or not as well. So to be very clear, the freedom of speech is, one of my friends actually mentioned, freedom of speech is not a freedom, but a right that is restricted to certain people in the country, which is very true. And we've seen that considering the minorities we have in the country, we don't expect them to exercise the same freedom of speech, because while we have the liberty and we have the power, considering being the majority, in terms of whether we are coming from a political party or we are coming from a certain ruling party or from a certain majority religion, we don't expect them to exercise it. And then when they do exercise it, we do have restrictions which we can actually just enforce out of nowhere, which at the end of the day, even if it's a liberty or a right I can enforce or not a liberty, it will always put people in trouble. And the second thing is, because our legislations, I would like to put an example out there, is about the Cyber Crimes Act that was passed in 2016. While technically that's an act that is supposed to govern and regulate cyber crimes taking online. Pretty much, it's very easy to understand, and it's probably going to be very easy for anyone to understand considering the name Cyber Crimes Act, okay? But there's a specific provision in that legislation that states that the authority has the right to curb reasonable restrictions on anyone, considering if they go against national security, if they go against the glory of Islam, if they go against anything that the government consider is going to be a threat. What certain provisions like these do is that they actually confuse the purpose of an act itself. The fact that they're supposed to regulate online cyber crimes, but we can see that still the state itself will have the freedom, irrespective of what they consider as reasonable or what they consider as to be a matter of national security or to be a matter that goes against or undermines the government, to be enforced under a legislation which has nothing to do with which has nothing to do with regards to freedom of speech. So the people have no way out with regards to saying whatever they want, because we are aware of the fact that the legislations or the regulatory authorities are framed in a manner that the ruling elites of the country, or the fact the government can actually take access of those regulatory bodies and pass certain restrictions at that very moment. So my case would not be that, oh, let it be an absolute right or let it be not an absolute right, because it still doesn't make sense having an absolute right. But my take on freedom of speech would be make it very clear for people when they can cross the line, because what is hate speech at the end of the day could have definitions on making people aware of the fact that this is a category which or similar things would fall under hate speech. This is defamation, but apart from that, you're free to talk about certain things. Also, the fact that we have faced quite a lot of restrictions on journalists in the country, and it also falls back to the question of right to information the journalists hold in Pakistan. If they do not have access to information, then the question is placed upon whether their research was thorough enough to pass such an information. So there's an entire system which probably needs to change in regards to making a balanced freedom of speech a right available to everyone. Because to be very honest, it's not a right that is available to everyone in the country. And it's unlikely to be if we actually fix our legislations in a manner which are able to tell that to the general public that, well, hello, you can exercise it, but we are making it very clear when you can't. So I'll pass it on to Angelique, and she can take it from here.
Thank you, Ruff, and thank you, Shafkat. I think with regards to the jurisdiction that I will be presenting on is Africa. While doing research about this web series, it was quite interesting because there's this African Charter of Human Rights and all this, and Seychelles being part of it. We have this charter in which it says, you know, freedom of speech is this right that needs to be respected, and it has to have, everyone needs to have this, and it's a right that everyone should enjoy. And reading through the charter, they speak a lot of how the state should not involve itself in the freedom and what people say. But then you move further down and there's this limitation where it says that in certain cases, you can't just say whatever you want. There will be some sort of limitation. You can't say anything that comes to your mind and offend whoever you want. And so the interesting thing I feel is that, yes, everyone should have this freedom of expression and they can say whatever they want, but it should be limited, especially in culturally diverse countries like Africa, Malaysia, Pakistan, Bangladesh. It's that people will eventually get hurt. I mean, for example, in Seychelles, there was this case of a song that was sung by an artist. And in this song, there was a defamatory part in it that was an innuendo, but not everyone would understand it. And so this case went to court, and you're thinking, oh, it's just a song. Nobody should be offended by it. But there were people who did get offended. And so it's how does somebody take a song and take offense from it? It's a song at the end of the day. And so, yes, freedom of expression should just be, you know, balanced out, but it can't, because not everyone is the same. Our communities are very different as well. I'm from Seychelles, I can't come and say that I would feel comfortable expressing myself openly in somebody else's jurisdiction because I don't know how I'd feel, how the people over there feel, what are the customs. And so it's this understanding of, yes, I have the right. Do I need to use it all the time? Probably not. Do I need to realize that what I'm saying could offend people? For sure. So education goes back to that. And people need to know that not everything needs to be restricted, yes. But when it causes other people to get hurt or offended, then there is this balance and check that needs to be done. And that balance and check is by the government. And so with going back to the charter that all these African countries have signed, you look at it and not everyone actually is imposing what has been said in this charter. And yes, we have this fantastic piece of paper that tells you how you're meant to do it. Freedom of speech is this right everyone needs to enjoy. Access to information, like Ruff mentioned as well, is quite important. But you can't have each and every government in countries in Africa to share the same point of view. And so with regards to it being unfettered, I suppose it shouldn't be. And so this will continue probably long before we're done on where this balance will lie. And so I think it's quite hard to sit down and say whether it is a liberty or a claim, because it's very different for everyone else. And so I'd like to pass it on to Dara, who might have a completely different idea or might share the same sort of thing that I have just spoken on. So please, Dara, thank you.
Thank you. So I have already talked about how subjective speech is and how harm is, and when you experience harm, you know you're going to be far more likely to experience a certain type of harm than somebody else. It's really, really subjective. So then I've talked about how these things that are far more objective and more likely to be offensive, these are the things that really we should start to regulate. But then I want to now pose the question to you: who decides that? In a democratic system, we have the government. They are obviously elected as representatives of the people, so they will be showing what society wants, and they should really go with what the majority in society have decided. Okay, this is this level of offense and harm that we really want to be regulated. But it needs to be flexible, because it's always going to be a case-by-case situation, because as I've mentioned, it is going to continue to be subjective. it is very, very difficult in each instance to work out, okay, is this appropriate? Is this not? But when we're talking about who decides, and we're talking about a government deciding, a lot of the time a government are going to be the elite. For example, and even in the judiciary, for example, Lady Hale talks about how in the UK, the judiciary is filled with a lot of people who have never experienced a lot of the issues that they're going to then be making judgments on. So it's really, really difficult, because we're then giving the loudest voices and the elites in society the ability to make those decisions. So I then turn to the necessity and proportionality, things that Shaf or Ahmed has mentioned. And this is sort of the European way of looking at it. And once a law has been made, we then use, is it necessary? Was this law proportional, or was the judgment in proportion to the situation that happened? And that, I think, is a really good way of holding the government and the judiciary to account, so that these elites aren't necessarily overstepping their boundaries and the powers that have been given to them, and they are listening to society to a certain extent. However, that's still going to be potentially elites making those decisions in the European court. So it is still kind of like difficult, I think, to work out who should be making these decisions. And then something that I also want you to think about maybe is rights as a whole. There is a cultural relativist critique, which is something that I look at in my PhD. And the cultural relativist critique is that rights come from Western philosophy in the first place. They come from people like John Locke, like Thomas Hobbes. These people were British and French philosophers who came up with the ideas of natural rights. And then the right to freedom of speech or freedom of expression comes from that. So we have something that then is dominated by this Western philosophy and this Western point of view. So that's also problematic. And so I say, well, how do we regulate that? How do we ensure that these elites aren't always the ones making the decision? Considering it's so subjective, yes, we need flexibility. But then where something is so offensive that we definitely need to step in, how do we address things so that we can ensure that these elites and Western hegemony is not taking over and dominating the conversation and saying, okay, you have to say what we find acceptable? Because I think it's quite obnoxious of the West to say, okay, well, we can tell you what you can and can't say. And I don't have all the answers. I'm still researching these things and trying to work out what my opinion is. But I pose this to you so that you can maybe think about it and think about how you think we could address those situations. And now I would like to pass this on to Priyank to find out what you think. Thank you.
Thanks, Tara. I think it's a really interesting point you raised, one of your final points about the fact that a lot of what we consider human rights, if I could extrapolate it to that, is sort of based on a Western view of looking at the world, and these inalienable rights, as they're referred to in the US Constitution, for example. We're brought up to believe that, you know, gender equality, freedom of speech, access to education, these are universal human rights. In my work, I travel to a lot of different countries in less developed parts of the world where they've got very different value systems. And I'm always, you know, they don't always align with what I see as a definition of human rights. And I think it's really worth thinking about, because even people in the developing world sometimes hold our own cultures to a standard that was set by a foreign culture, right? And I think that that's not necessarily wrong, because you can grow by interacting with, as anybody who's traveled will tell you that, you know, just because a standard is coming from a foreign country doesn't mean it's wrong, but it does mean that it's not inalienable. So I think the key thing for people who are interested in free speech to maybe recognize and acknowledge is that you may believe that free speech is a good thing, and that but it would be, I think, mistaken to assume that free speech is inherently or is somehow a God-given or an inalienable right. I don't think there's any such thing as an inalienable right. And I think if you travel enough, you will come to that conclusion as well. I don't think anybody can say there's a universal code of morality that all cultures follow. Even things like murder and rape. There's a quote that I can't remember who said, but they said, you know, nothing nothing is good and nothing is evil. It's just outdated. And if you go back far enough, there are periods of history where our views on murder, our views on rape, and all these things were very different. So it's totally conceivable that we look back one day on the 21st century and say, I can't believe they had such a ridiculous view on free speech. So I guess that it's good to keep in mind when, especially those of you who are legal experts, I'd be curious to know your thoughts. And then from a script writing, and we're going to go to Gobind after this, but from an artistic freedom of expression point of view, one of the things, and I'm curious to know, Gobind, what you think, but as somebody who's written before for TV and for publications, like, I think one of the things art can do is push those bounds of what, you know, and make us rethink what we take for granted. So I think a great, you know, The Handmaid's Tale, which is a show that's really popular in the US right now, which reimagines a world where sort of a very, very conservative form of religion becomes normal, and the United States becomes a super repressive place for women. I think it forces you to reimagine what you think of as normal gender equality today, or you know, even movies that have talked about limitations on free speech or draconian sort of, you know, or books like 1984 or The Thought Police. I think literature and art have played a huge role in helping us understand that fundamental point that nothing is permanent, nothing is inalienable, everything is fluid, everything can change if you're not vigilant to fight for what you believe in. And I frankly think there's nothing that can do that as powerfully as art, because I think history just isn't as imaginative as art. Not enough has happened there. And also more boring to study for most people than watching a movie. So Gobind, I mean, that's a good transition to you, I guess, to just see, like, when you're writing, you know, you said you write about real world problems. How comfortable are you, like, pushing those bounds and exploring what you might not be comfortable to say in a nonfiction context, but having a character espouse a certain point of view, or having a plot imagine a world that we're uncomfortable talking about? How effective have you seen that be in actually getting people to think outside their comfort zone?
Thanks for the question, Priyank. It's a great question. Actually, to be honest, I think art actually helps a lot more, because even in Malaysia and Singapore, we do have a lot of social commentary that's done through art, because as our freedom of speech isn't really as advanced as we'd like it to be, but there are still hot button issues that we do want to talk about, and Malaysians and Singaporeans have found that if you do it through caricatures or you do it through cartoons, people get less offended by it, and then you actually get to start to have a conversation about it, and it's the art itself that actually promoted that discussion and move the needle in ways that no one could ever foresee before. We in our country, we had terrible race riots in the 70s, 60s and 70s, but since then, through minor progressions, his name is Lat. He was a legendary cartoonist. He's no longer active anymore. But when he was there, he weekly he wrote about hot button issues, and he got Malaysians and Singaporeans to talk about things that usually was never said. So I do think the value of art is actually understated, and actually with art you can achieve a lot more things than you would actually realize. But going back to the judicial aspect of free speech, in Malaysia and Singapore, what we've seen is more of the people in power using the judiciary as a crutch, and not just as a crutch, but as a weapon to weaponize their version of free speech, and basically set out to the public in a way that if you were to go against anything that we say or anything we stand for, we would make sure that we would set an example out of you, so that your actions are not repeated later on. We have expressed provisions in our constitution for freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and freedom of assembly. But at the same time, the next section immediately after that allows for restrictions to be placed if the people in power were to deem that these freedoms would be in contravention of public morality, which is a very, very vague and broad catch-all term, basically. And also, moving on from that, we also have the Internal Security Act in Malaysia and Singapore, the ISA, which has been used pretty much as a weapon and as a cane for mostly towards the members of the opposition or just people with voices that are too loud for the people in power to hear. So in that aspect, it is sad to see that that the judiciary is being used as a weapon instead of as a place where you go to actually resolve issues, which is what it should be. Moving it back, and with that, I would like to hand it back over to Shafqan.
Great. Thank you, Govind. And also just really fun to hear about both yours and Priyank's perspectives on how art pushes the boundaries for all of this. Always been a massive advocate for trying to push social narratives through art. And one of my favorite poets of all time did that at a very early age. I mean, not a very early age, but back in the days of Bengal. And I mentioned him today because yesterday was Bengali New Year's. Rabindranath Tagore wrote a lot on how social narratives needed to change around the time that he was born and around the time that he was living in society. Him, Raja Ram Mohan Rai, and Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, I think, in my opinion, are some of the founders of Bengali social philosophy as we've moved forward. But sorry, I digress. I'm a bit of a fanboy when it comes to the world of literature and poetry. But what we're getting out of this discussion so far, and it's something that I've picked up on, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are two things that seem to be of concern when it comes to freedom of speech and how we're looking at it. First of all, there's a lack of clarity in a lot of situations as to how freedom of speech is regulated and where these lines lie. We are not sure to what degree we can say what we say. The fact that I can't give you a lot of examples right now should possibly tell you where I lie on that spectrum in terms of my own jurisdictions. But clarity seems to be a bit of an issue. And we've heard from one of our panelists where she's mentioned that whatever it is, it's important that we understand where these rights lie. But at the same time, we've heard from another one of our panelists where because we recognize that all of these harms and all of the things, values associated with freedom of speech can often be so subjective in nature and can often be subjective in terms of the degree and the extent to which they can cause you the harm or the effect. There needs to be a case-by-case assessment of each situation. So proportionality is relatively important as well. And to that effect, we also have an understanding of the whole idea of power asymmetry within our society. The dominance, as we say, as Priyank points out and as Dara points out, a lot of these freedoms or a lot of these rights values are seen as West-centric values. And as a result, we often tend to just believe that these West-centric values are the ones that voice the initial stages of these rights, and therefore that became the ethos of it all. I would argue then that there comes a point in our society when we're looking at these freedoms and we're looking at values where we need to understand that clarity must trump certain things. Your right, whatever that right may be, whether it's the right to life or anything, nothing is ever unqualified or unfettered. It is constantly in a competition with other rights, not just your other competing rights, but equally the rights of other individuals within that same fabric of society. What this means, again, is that it comes back to that whole discussion of dominance and to what degree do we allow dominance in society or in that hierarchical structure to ultimately shape the next generation of speakers. And that's where next generation of individuals trying to exercise these rights. And that's where I think this is ultimately going to become the focal point, for lack of a better expression. We have at least we've now come to a point where I'm starting to realize we've managed to cover 3 of the intended segments. We have ultimately spoken about free speech philosophy at a very broad scale. We have spoken about how different jurisdictions work with these restrictions and liberties, and we've talked about how these restrictions and liberties have been shaped through philosophy in many ways. And finally, how they're coming up and having an impact on global politics. And we've all given our cursory views on that. But to end on that very note of how important these discussions can be, because I think I learned a lot from hearing everyone here today. And I'm so grateful for everyone who's participated in this and who are sending us questions. And I would love to end today's little panel discussion by inviting the rest of my panelists to go one by one and perhaps give us an understanding of what they think was an achievement that free speech, either regulation or unfettered free speech, achieved in the realm of politics that you want to give a shout out to, and how that's impacted your vision of politics. And unless anyone wants to go first, I'm happy to start by pointing out.
You go first because we need to think about it for a minute.
Absolutely. Take your time, and think about it this way. Whether it be through opinion, as Hobbes will point out in Leviathan, it's usually restrictions come in the forms of laws or in the form of socially coercive opinions. But whether it be through the vision of opinions or whether it be through by the use of law, the N-word has been taken out of effective circulation in society. The harms associated, that word in and of itself, it has been historically associated with such hardships and such horrible, horrendous trauma. It needed to be taken out of circulation. If in the world of the US Constitution or in the world of unfettered rights, we allowed individuals to continue to use such inflammatory words or use such terminology, whether it be in a private or public setting, the fact that that individual has even another audience who might hear that word and then reuse it, or even the potential for that harm to occur. I think the success of socially coercing the N-word out of circulation was a massive success in our contemporary history. And it is something that we need to celebrate. And similarly, there are opinions that I personally think need to be taken out of circulation, especially opinions that divide society, opinions that divide polities. We're all one, and we all deserve to have the ability to look at the other person beside us and treat them as an equal and be treated as an equal. And free speech and how you speak to someone else goes a long way in shaping the foundations of that very interaction. Anyone else? Govind the
Go first. Govind, yay. Thank you.
I would like to ask if I could slightly vary the question, because I mean, it just seems more fun. So instead of, yeah, so instead of praising one moment that actually seemed like someone championing free speech, I would like to do the opposite in something that ASEAN, it's something that ASEAN and Southeast Asian countries in general could do better, which is the idea of free speech being the ability to say whatever you want. But I think there's also another aspect to it that's very important, which a lot of opposition, political parties belonging to the opposition in Southeast Asian countries can attest to, which is another very important part to the freedom of speech, is the freedom to be heard. Mm-hmm. And for example, in Cambodia, there's rampant they have English, they're reporting in English about whatever is going on in the country, and it's pretty fair. But then when you go into it and you look at it and you realize that most Cambodians read the papers in Khmer, in Khmer, and they can't read English. They need to read it in their national language, and the national language is unfortunately monopolized by the government, and it's state-owned media. Then you don't really get freedom of speech in any extent, even though it does appear to be that way. You're only targeting a select few people that don't really affect your populace anyways. The people you're getting your message out to are the people that are leaving your country. Why do you need, how much social impact can they make? How much social change can they make? So I do think that one thing that Southeast Asian countries need to do, and just as a whole, is to ensure that everyone has the right to be heard, or just having that avenues for people to be heard. Whether or not they say the right thing or the wrong thing is something to be decided on later on. It's just having that avenue there to begin with.
Yeah, that is indeed quite concerning.
Govind, you have brought up such a sensitive topic about language. It might cause like an issue between Shafkat and I right now. Probably we're going to be like debating over the language, which
we will
keep it out of the thing. But we've taken into consideration what Govind has said, of course. Angelique, Priyank, Dara.
Yeah, yes, sorry. Yeah, like I was saying, I think what I've taken away from this especially is that most of the policies and the ideals are Western ideas and philosophies. And so I think in terms of Africa especially, I think it's developing our own philosophies and implementing it into our own way, because at the end of the day, we can't really relate to Western ideas in so much so that we can implement it completely. And so I think one of the things that needs to be improved is potentially developing our own sort of ideas of what freedom of expression and access to information should be in our context. And from then on, it would probably be easier to implement, and the government could have a better idea of what needs to be dealt with. Because like Dara said, it's always going to be the subjective issue, and by developing our own philosophies, we know exactly what it is that might trigger people, what cannot trigger people, what could be acceptable and what is not acceptable. So I think that's something that we could potentially look into, and I think that that would be the best way to approach this, right? And I think it would be a beneficial thing for Africa and potentially the world in itself. So Asia and all the jurisdiction as well, making it their own. And so I think that's what I wanted to highlight and bring out. So I'll pass it on to Dara then and get her opinion on what she thinks.
I think I definitely agree with you. I think one of the biggest problems with international law and with human rights in general is that Western-centric view. And that obviously comes from a lot of very sad history. So I think if we're going to try and move forward with the world and make things more inclusive and make things work better, then we definitely need to have these voices as elevated. And even if different areas of the world are going to interpret things in their own way and bring about these things how they feel is appropriate, then I think also you're going to need the platform on an international level. So I think it's great that we have things like the UN and all of that, but also we have the P5, and a lot of Western countries dominate things, and some of the biggest decisions that are made in international law are still made by Western states. So I think that we also need to ensure that other states are given these platforms, that whenever these other states have developed their ways of thinking, that they also have a platform to be able to share that and to be able to advance that as well. I think that's really important, because we shouldn't have one standard for every country in the world. That's really difficult, especially with freedom of speech, because if even within one country, there's going to be such a plethora of point of views, then within the international community and the entire world, there are going to be so many views and so many difficult things to think about. And just adding on to what we've all added, I think a positive of freedom of speech in general in British politics is that recently we've obviously been talking a lot about equality, and as a result, a lot of universities have adopted anti-Semitism policies and definitions of anti-Semitism, which I think is a really, really good move forward, and I'm really glad that that is happening. But maybe a negative of things to do with freedom of speech in the UK and politics in the UK at the minute is that we have so much information and then misinformation about things like vaccines that it's very difficult to work out what is what is correct, what is not, who should you be listening to? And it is that marketplace of ideas idea that John Stuart Mills came up with and that Shaf has mentioned. But it's very, very difficult because then we have so many different views that you don't really know what's right. And so it's made things to do with vaccines very difficult for people to make decisions on whether or not they feel safe taking that, or if they do or don't. And it's been very difficult. So I think that's also a negative, that you can have so many point of views that may not necessarily be offensive or wrong, but it's very difficult because misinformation is spread and then people find it difficult to make decisions. So that's what I have to add. And I would like to now pass it on to Priyank to add to this.
Sure, thanks, Tara. I think to your question, Chef, about an incident where free speech helped or hurt. I mean, I think before COVID started dominating global headlines, we were all talking about the Hong Kong protests. And I think that's kind of an example that stands out in my mind of where a lack of free speech led to kind of, I think, an unfortunate situation. So regardless of the politics of it, and I'm no expert on politics in Hong Kong or in mainland China, but it was clear that there were people who had a very strong point of view, and that point of view was not being allowed to fully express itself. And I think that sometimes creates a more tense environment, leads to more violence than is necessary. So I think that was a good cautionary tale, but I do fully agree with what Dara was saying about the misinformation problem. We see that too. And I think the problem with the marketplace of ideas is the same as the problem with the marketplace of anything, which is that markets aren't looking out for your best interest. They're not out to screw you either. They're not concerned with your well-being. They're concerned with efficient functioning and supply meeting demand. And sometimes that ends up being good for your physical health and mental health, and sometimes that ends up being bad. But I think that as long as we're aware of that, we don't look at markets as a good or bad force. That's like looking at gravity as a good or bad force. I mean, it's a force. And I think that the problem I have with certain politics that looks at, whether you're sort of laissez-faire, if you believe in the market, I've never understood that. The market isn't, a religion. I don't know how you can believe in it. It's a description of what we've seen happen usually when people try to compete for resources. So yeah, I'd say that the way we are skeptical of markets in an economic framework, we should apply that same skepticism to the marketplace of ideas, which isn't to say that we should ban free markets. Just means we should have a healthy skepticism and be aware. That's it.
Thank you.
I'd like, well, I guess you'd like to speak.
So
pass it to you.
Thank you, because that is something that does resonate with a lot of my viewpoints. Skepticism is absolutely necessary. But off to Ruff to take us to home plate.
Yeah, and then I think we're just over the time, and we're just gonna end it then. It's just it was a funny thing I read. It's very easy to rule over the ignorant population, and I think we are that, and how we can actually better frame freedom of speech actually comes from the fact whether we want to as well or not. As humans, are we okay with the current system as well? So that's one thing. And whether we are okay with the restrictions that are placed on how much do we protest on it, because we all come from different backgrounds. Dara being a PhD student researching on it, Priyank being in the field, the rest of us being lawyers and lecturers and academics and whatsoever. We have the idea that freedom of speech still has the ground to strike policy changes in each of our jurisdictions and make it a little better and balanced. But the idea that if we still want to be ignorant and we still want to live in the society where people who are actually having placed in the government settings or be placed in the judiciary are willing to just have people who are ignorant, the system is not going to change. So it's either going to be the change in the law itself that comes first, or the change that comes from the people that want the law to be changed or made very clear, so that we're still living in that zone where we're not sure who's going to make the first move. And of course, making a move with wanting to change freedom of speech, the law, or making it more clear is going to have its repercussions. The change in society obviously has repercussions, civil public civil rights are going to be affected. Protests are going to be coming out, but that's only going to be when we realize that whether we want that change or not. And having this discussion today on the platform actually indicates that all of us, some way or the other, want that to be changed, and we can strike that difference in our own industries and areas of practices. And just letting it end here, it's just a food for thought that do you want the freedom of speech to be expanded or not requires you to think individually. And for that, we need to study where are the restrictions being placed, which you're not okay with, rather than just thinking that we're not okay with the restrictions being placed. That's a holistic view. So pinpointing out what you're not okay with it is the first thing to change the entire freedom itself. So ending it here, I would like to thank everyone who's joined and for the panelists, they've taken out the time, and we're on different time zones. So I really appreciate Priyank, Dara, Angelique, Gobind, and Shafkat taking up the time. Shafkat being the philosophical guru, that's what I call him. We've learned a lot from you because we don't have that academic background. And the guests we have with us also. Thank you so much for bearing with us. Unfortunately, we'll not be able to take the questions that are posted on Facebook, but I'll be tagging individually the panelists who are here, and they can answer the questions right there in the comments. We're just going to end it. Shafkat, you want to end it and say bye-bye to the world looking at you and freedom of speech?
No, just